If you missed this, just days before Juneteenth, the federal holiday commemorating the day the last enslaved people in the Confederacy learned that they were free, the Trump administration moved to try and block a first-of-its-kind reparations program for black Americans. The landmark initiative offered payments to some black residents of Evanston, Illinois, and their direct descendants to address racist housing policies that spanned the course of 5 decades in the Chicago suburb. Between 1919 and 1969, Evanston's black residents were restricted from buying property in what had been deemed desirable areas reserved for white residents. Instead, black residents were confined to neighborhoods that were poorly invested in and often lacked access to health care and quality food, clean air, stable housing, and the impact is still lingering. A city health assessment from 2022 found that residents of Evanston's historically black Fifth Ward have a life expectancy between 5 and 13 years shorter than residents of some predominantly white neighborhoods. Evanston has since tried to right those wrongs. Since 2021, families and descendants directly impacted by those policies have been eligible for grants of up to $25,000 to help cover down payments, interest, other housing-related expenses on property within the city. Residents, regardless of race, who experience discrimination due to the city's policies or practices after 1969 also qualified. And now that program is under threat. The Department of Justice is now intervening in an ongoing lawsuit to try and put an end to this reparations program. This is what the Department of Justice says. Under the pretext of paying reparations for events more than 100 years ago, the city of Evanston has chosen to distribute millions of dollars in cash and housing benefits to people because of the color of their skin or the color of the skin of their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents. Contrary to what the Justice Department is saying, this program is not funneling money to people because they are black or their ancestors are black. The City Council created this initiative for those directly victimized by housing discrimination. Civil rights advocates have spent decades arguing that reparations are necessary, not only to address more recent forms of racial discrimination, but also to reckon with the nation's original sin, slavery, which makes the timing of this move from the administration even more revealing. Joining me now, Imani Perry, professor of African American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Harvard University, and Dorothy Brown, Georgetown law professor and the author of Getting to Reparations: How Building a Different America Requires a Reckoning with Our Past. I'm so grateful to both of you for being here this morning. And Professor Perry, let's start with you. Does this move by the Trump administration, I think I know the answer, come to you as a surprise?
No, it's not a surprise. And I also think, just in terms of context, it's important to keep in mind that we really have had 50 years, over the past 50 years, that anti-discrimination law has been interpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court in a way to make it exceedingly difficult to remedy historic discrimination. And historic discrimination, of course, has an impact on the present moment. In some ways, this goes a step further. The Evanston program should meet the highest level of scrutiny, right? It is narrowly tailored. Evanston is a small town. We're talking about really direct injury to residents of that town. And so what is shaping up to be is that not only is there extreme difficulty in remedying discrimination, but also there is a commitment to keeping discrimination intact, to keeping inequality intact, and also in some ways extending present discrimination. We think about things like the Voting Rights Act. So it doesn't surprise me, but it's more evidence that they are clearly functioning with Jim Crow justice at the center of their thoughts.
Professor Brown, from just a purely legal perspective, do you think this lawsuit will go anywhere?
Well, their motion to intervene certainly shouldn't, because for the reasons you stated, I read the motion to intervene, and they basically say Evanston is giving out money based on the color of your skin, but that's exactly not what Evanston is doing. They are remedying past discrimination that they engaged in. Black Americans in Evanston, Illinois had a target on their back, and the government placed the target on their back. So when the motion to intervene by the Trump administration says, oh, this is just because of the color of their skin, well, the discrimination, the weaponization of the government was because of the color of their skin.
Professor Perry, I wanted to ask you, because this is the latest initiative by the Trump administration to roll back progress, and it has not been hard to see. It's happening in plain sight for everyone. Over the past year, we've seen them dismantle entire government programs, cancel public health grants. They laid off federal workers as an attempt to eliminate, they say, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion practices across the country. What do you see as why the current administration is so particularly fixated on rolling back progress for people of color in this country?
Oh, I mean, I think that in some ways that becomes the red meat of equality. And so that for in this period in which Americans across the board, from the poor to the middle class, are experiencing the roughing of our national coffers by a tiny fraction of the billionaire class, right? One of the ways to appeal to people's sense of vulnerability, to white Americans' sense of vulnerability, is to attack people of color, to attack immigrants, to attack undocumented people and the like. And so part of it is the fomenting of that kind of historic hostility. It's very simple red meat in this country to say, well, it's their fault.
And Professor Brown, in your book, you point out reparations have been achieved for other ethnic groups in this country in the past. What is it in particular about this being so hard to achieve, reparations for Black Americans in this country?
Well, what my book shows is that reparations paid for by the United States government is as American as apple pie. We paid it to white enslavers when workers in the District of Columbia were emancipated. We paid it to Italy for Italians lynched in Louisiana. We paid it to tribal nations for land theft and economic exploitation. And we paid it to Japanese Americans for their mass incarceration during World War II, but not to Black Americans. Because even though reparations is as American as apple pie, so is anti-Black discrimination. And we've seen it with respect to who has received reparations for things that happened to Black Americans: slavery, lynching, economic exploitation, and mass incarceration, but never to Black Americans. And I argue in the book, and I will say now, that the Trump administration is going to help Black Americans get to reparations. This anti-weaponization fund, which doesn't roll off the tongue, is really about reparations for J6 insurrectionists. Let's talk about what it really is. And if we want to take into account the government being weaponized against a group of Americans, that is Black Americans.
Yeah, reparations for people who brutalized Capitol police officers at a moment where our democracy was on the line. And it was hard not to think about this, Professor Perry, when I was at the Obama Center earlier this week for the opening. I'd love to play a little bit of what President Obama said in his speech. Let's watch.
The exhibits in the center are not meant to evoke nostalgia for some gauzy bygone era, some unattainable past. They're meant to remind us of who we can be, to remind us of what's possible, so we can forge ahead, clear-eyed and confident, and do the work that still needs to be done.
They are meant to remind us of who we can be, to remind us what's possible so we can forge ahead. How do we continue to forge ahead when the Trump administration seems to be pulling out all the stops at every turn to reverse progress?
I mean, I think in one way, it requires us not simply to experience those moments, and it was a beautiful moment, to experience those kinds of moments and emotionally react. But then we have to actually take it upon ourselves to engage in the work of democracy, which means both a commitment to, of course, sort of voting, civic participation, the logic of Frederick Douglass when he said power concedes nothing without a demand, the demands that happen when people organize and protest and the like, and also to understand that knowledge is power. So, I mean, one example is to read Professor Brown's book and actually understand the mechanisms of representation, and to think and to use work like that in order to organize ourselves to protest and to organize for a response to this, pervasive and consistent practice of inequality.
Imani Perry, professor of African American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Harvard University, and Dorothy Brown, professor of law at Georgetown. Thank you both so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.